In the late 1930s, when air power was being recast by the demands of a new and terrible war, a modest engineer named Geoffrey de Havilland offered a proposition that seemed to most like a curiosity from an earlier century. Build a high-speed bomber, mostly from wood. Fit it with the same powerful Merlins that drove fighters to the edge of the sky. Leave out defensive guns and turrets. Trim away the weight of superstition and convention, and let velocity be its shield. The idea was absurd to the policies and prejudices of bureaucrats and generals. Metal, they said, was the future. Wood was an anachronism from canvas-slung biplanes and trench warfare. Yet where others saw scarcity, they saw possibility. Britain in 1938 faced the arithmetic of rearmament. Aluminum was precious, rationed, argued over by departments and ministries. De Havilland's brilliance, if that is the word to apply to an obstinate conceit, lay in recognizing that the nation had artisans, piano makers, furniture craftsmen, skilled hands idle for want of work. They could build aircraft if someone thought to give them designs that honored their craft. When the prototype finally took to the air in late autumn of 1940, the experiment surprised even its makers. Painted that training yellow that marked hopeful machines not yet baptized by war, it lifted from Hatfield. The test pilot felt more than flight. He felt an eagerness. The Mosquito, if the name was modest, its performance certainly was not, gave promise on the wind. Tests would show it could run with fighters. It could do more than pretend to be a bomber. It could be fast enough to become its own defense. Design, however, is only the preface to history. The story that matters next concerns small hands in an RAF maintenance hut, the engineering margins in a Rolls-Royce spec sheet, and a single decision to treat limits as negotiable when the stakes were human lives rather than warranty disclaimers. Roderick Banks was a fitter, a man in overalls whose official duty stopped where manuals began. He was not supposed to tinker with the sacred pages of Rolls-Royce. His job was to follow their instructions with the steady piety of mechanics who understand that lives depend on standards. And yet, Banks had a private life of study. He read the dense appendices the same way a poet reads lineation, for the possibilities hidden beneath the rules. Apprenticed at Derby, schooled in the language of tolerances and thermal tables, he returned to the RAF not as a mechanic who obeyed, but as a mechanic who understood why the rules existed and where they might be pushed. By 1943, the Mosquito was proving its worth in raids and reconnaissance missions, but the margin that had kept it safe when it was new had begun to thin. German fighters were evolving. The Luftwaffe's new models closed gaps that had been safety buffers. Pilots returned with shaving stories, tracer threads passing too close, dives that only just preserved separation. The Mosquito's speed, once a fortress, was becoming a contested ground. Banks noticed something in the documentation that most did not, a difference between a conservatively written maximum and the engineering reality that the tests implied. The Rolls-Royce manuals were not lying. They were, by design, cautious. They had to be. Engines were shipped across peacetime economies to squadrons with variable maintenance, men with variable skill, fuel of variable quality. The limits in the manuals were guarantees that the company could offer on a mass scale. But a man who knew the engines intimately, who had spent shift after shift measuring compressions and tracing bearing fits, could see that some specimens had slack left in their bellies. It is simple arithmetic to say that a handful of pounds of boost yields hundreds of horsepower, and that horsepower buys speed. But it is dangerous to leave the story at arithmetic. For the Merlin, increased boost is a tightrope walk between extra thrust and explosive disaster. Detonation, pre-ignition, melted pistons. Fuel mix, magneto timing, cylinder temperature. All of these were chess pieces on a board. Banks understood the moves because he had memorized the table of consequences. So he began, quietly, on a single engine on a single test stand. Not because he had a mandate, but because the alternative, complacency, had begun to feel like complicity. He softened the spring in a boost regulator by fractions, enlarged a jet or two in the carburetor by sizes so small they could be dismissed as the work of a careless hand. He advanced magneto-timing by degrees that a spreadsheet would call negligible and a pilot would call fundamental. He did not gamble recklessly. He selected engines with surgical care. Newly overhauled bottom ends, compressions consistent across cylinders, bearings within the tautest tolerances. He treated each Merlin like an instrument that, if tended correctly, could sing a little higher without tearing itself apart. When he ran the engine on the stand and watched gauges climb past the red lines the manuals had drawn, he felt the same mixture of dread and possibility any craftsman does when he realizes his work is about to be judged by reality. Temperatures rose. They held. Metal throbbed. Nothing failed. The instrument reading suggested that Banks was on the edge of what the engine could do, and on the right side of survival. But the RAF was a bureaucracy by temperament. It is one thing to show an instructor a graph in a test bay. It is another to alter a squadron aircraft on the eve of a mission. Banks needed a person who would accept practical truth over the comfort of doctrine. He found squadron leader Peter Channer, a man with 3 tours behind him, and a patience for policy that had been worn thin by encounter. Channer had been nearly caught in the egress of a raid, close enough to read masks and resolve on a German pilot's face. He understood the difference between theorizing about survival and confronting a fighter in a sky full of lead. They did it in the twilight hours, when the station's engineering officer had gone home, and the world was soft enough to hide the clatter of change. Banks and 2 riggers worked through the night on DZ-414. To the eye, nothing changed. To the gauges, to the heart, everything did. Banks made a vague logbook entry, fuel mixture optimization, and left the rest to fate. The first trial in the air read like a paragraph of legend. On a reconnaissance mission in April 1943, flying high over enemy territory, Channer's Mosquito was engaged by 2 FW-190s. The fighters were cunning and fast. Their pilots practiced in converging attack geometry, hoping the Mosquito's speed would run low under strain. Channer, who trusted Banks more than manuals in that moment, pushed his throttles past their stops. The boost climbed. The Merlins howled. The airspeed unwound past numbers that had been thought fiction. The Mosquito's sleek wooden lines ate the air. It accelerated not in small increments, but as if pulled by a giant hand. The German fighters tried to match in a dive, their radials screaming. They closed briefly, then lost ground. The Mosquito left them behind. Word of that escape spread as it always does in close quarters. Fast, breathless, and adulterated through repeated telling. Channer told those who would listen. Those who flew listened with an attentiveness born of the sort that values life over procedure. Soon, more of Banks's modifications slipped into other aircraft. Not with papers stamped and approved, but with whispered consent and toleration by commanders whose interest lay in men returning alive more than in engineers' paperwork. The result was not merely anecdotes. As the months advanced, the data hardened into pattern. Mosquitoes fitted with Banks's tweaks showed markedly lower loss rates on comparable operations. Crews who survived more missions learned to press advantage, to fly with the confidence that stern engineering had bought them. The virtues compounded. Survival yielded experience. Experience yielded better bombing accuracy and mission success, and success returned as more daring raids into heavily defended territory. These raids would culminate, in a way the planners could barely have conceived, in a mission that balanced audacity and moral urgency in equal measure. By early 1944, intelligence whispered of a prison in northern France, where the Gestapo intended to carry out executions. The urgency of the prison's timetable, names, dates, the machinery of state repression moving inexorably, left little room for deliberation. London decided. Do something precise, surgical, a single raid to breach walls, to break doors, to give prisoners the slimmest chance of escape. It was the sort of operation that offered no margin for error, no room for improvisation in the air. Operation Jericho, as it would be known, required low-level flying in daylight, bombing precise structural elements of a fortified building, and returning through a sky that would be irrevocably alerted. The planners liked Mosquitoes for the job, not merely because of their speed, but because they could be flown low and fast, because their wooden frames were less likely to deceive radar, and their nimbleness made them hard targets. But speed and nimbleness alone would not be enough. The aircraft would need every advantage. On the morning of the operation, formation after formation of mosquitoes rose from English soil. Pilots checked instruments the way surgeons check monitors before an incision. They passed brief words with navigators and bombardiers, last jokes like borrowed talismans against the seriousness that followed. Banks's modifications, where they had been installed, would be counted among a long list of quiet decisions that made the difference between catastrophe and return. They flew over the channel like a line of black punctuation against a pale sea. On approach, they dropped altitude, slipping under the cloud decks, the ground handrail becoming a metronome for navigation. There is a kind of intimacy to low-level flight that strips away abstraction. The world fills with small things, spires, hedgerows, which way the smoke from a chimney leans. And standing between those small things and the fate of men inside the prison were the pilots, their hands on throttles, their mind on the physics that convert boost to speed, torque to survival. When the bombs fell that day, they did so with grotesque precision. Walls fell where intended. Courtyards opened like wounds where prisoners had been held. The breach in brick and mortar was a crude mercy. The mission's success, what remained of it, was measured in minutes and in human scatterings. Prisoners who ran, guards who shouted, a cascade of chaos the planners had hoped for, and the operators prayed would yield lives. The air over the field became another battlefield on the way home. Intercepting fighters rushed up like a phrase returned to puncture the sentence. Mosquitoes, some still carrying the scars of the attack, were now lightened by the act of mercy they had wrought. Banks's modifications mattered. They were the hidden edge that allowed pilots to extend their speed envelope and outrun desperate pursuers. Lives that day were credited to many causes, but among them was the quiet work of a fitter who read the margins as if they were a map. This way of looking at things is the historian's temptation, to assign causality like checkmarks on a list. The truth of wartime decisions is messier. Luck and timing, weather, and the temperament of enemy pilots all contributed. Yet there are moments when technology and initiative conspire to tilt the probabilities. Banks's interventions did not single-handedly win the war. They did, however, change which missions were survivable and which were not. They redistributed risk in a theater of operations where small margins often meant the difference between life and loss. That the work was technically unsanctioned matters for how we think about responsibility. Rolls-Royce would have been appalled had it known. Their guarantee was voided by the mere idea of exceeding rated values. Their lab tests had been precise and ruthless. They knew how engines failed, and failure at 20,000 feet often meant no return. Insurance, reputation, and engineering ethics argued for conservative margins. The RAF's rulebooks, produced by committees who had never seen the weather of a North Sea afternoon or the frantic geometry of pursuit, preferred standardization. Banks existed in the narrow seam between what was permitted and what was imaginable. The seam is where improvisation and initiative live. It is also where careers can end in disgrace, where reputations can be risible, where small fortunes of fate are won or lost. Banks chose to gamble not for a medal or for glory, but for a practical morality that placed the lives of crews on one scale and bureaucratic comfort on the other. It is a quiet heroism, the sort that resists being packaged for parades. He did not seek recognition. He sought to convert knowledge into a margin that could be paid out in minutes of speed, and by extension, in breaths and futures. As the Mosquito went on to perform missions that read like both poetry and terror, low-level strikes, daring reconnaissance, night raids, the aircraft's reputation matured. It was elegant in flight and unapologetically pragmatic in purpose. Pilots came to trust its wooden bones and their own judgment. The world of aviation would not forget that a plane made largely of wood could outrun the elegance of metal, and that a fitter with a careful hand and a scholar's habit could alter the calculus of survival. After the war, history sought heroes and men of rank, in the planners and the tacticians and the inventors who stood in the sun of acclaim. It is in the smaller stories, the ones that gather in maintenance huts and test stands, that we find the texture of how conflict is actually prosecuted. Banks's work, performed off the books and in whispers, is a vivid example of how adaptation at the lower rungs of an organization can ripple outward with profound effect. The Mosquito story is not simply one of bold design and exotic materials. It is also a tale of hands that understood the engine's song, of a pilot who trusted a fitter more than a manual, of crews who owed their lives to margins shifted by nervous springs and slightly larger jets. If there is a moral, it is not a tidy one. The war demanded improvisation. Sometimes it demanded the bending of rules. The ethics of doing so is not self-evident. Banks risked not just engines but reputations, and he did so in the knowledge that a failure at altitude could kill his comrades and end his own life. He chose the risk for reasons we may admire or judge. More broadly, the story asks us to consider how institutions balance the prudence of standards against the need for daring when the cost of timidity is death. Years later, when monuments were planned and histories written, the Mosquito would be celebrated for its speed, its audacity, and its wood. Rolls-Royce would continue to refine engines with a scientist's doggedness. Squadron leaders would be honored, and pilots would be remembered in captions. And somewhere in the quiet texture of those memories would be the name of a fitter who read beyond the margin and turned technical nuance into days of life. This is not a tale that establishes simple causality. Rather, it is a portrait of how little things, an engineer's spring, a rigger's late-night tweak, a pilot's willingness to test the edge, combined to produce outsized effects. The Mosquito did not become invincible. It did not render fighter opposition irrelevant, but it became more survivable, more daring, a tool that allowed commanders to attempt missions that otherwise might have been unthinkable. In a war of industrial accumulation and bureaucratic momentum, the Mosquito's success reminds us that human judgment, knowledgeable, careful, sometimes audacious, remains a decisive force. The war moved on. New fighters came, and old ones were refined. Engines were improved, and new doctrines evolved. But the period during which the Mosquito operated at the razor edge of speed matters for what it reveals about the nature of technical trust. Rolls-Royce could not guarantee the life of every Merlin under heightened stress, but a handful of engines, tended with obsessive precision, could be trusted to perform beyond specification for the minutes that mattered. The RAF could no more institutionalize Roderick Banks's judgment than it could institutionalize chancing a pilot's instinct in the heat of combat. What it could do was, for a while, permit variance, quiet variance that returned more crews than it lost. When the smoke settled over the English countryside and the records were written, operational statistics would give part of the truth. Loss rates and sortie success and bombing accuracy could be tabulated, but the lived truth of soldiers and aviators is not exhausted by charts. It is held in the memory of men who walked away when, in strict compliance with doctrine, they should not have. It is in the laughter in a dispersal hut after a night of mission debriefs, in the quiet handshakes, in the letters home thanking the hands that had kept metal from melting and men from falling. That is the measure of Banks's legacy, not the glory of invention, but the stubborn, serviceable charity of skill. He read manuals not to follow them blindly, but to understand their architecture. Where the manuals existed to protect reputations and ensure mass reliability, Banks looked for ways to protect lives through selective and careful risk. His was the kind of courage that does not care for metals. It cares for engines that stay together when the wind and enemy intent conspire to tear them apart. The Mosquito remains in the annals of aviation as one of the more startling achievements of wartime ingenuity. An aircraft that refused easy categorization, that merged craft with performance, and that was propelled in no small part by people who read manuals like maps, and then walked beyond the written path when life demanded it. To speak of the plane is to speak of those who maintained it, who redesigned its heartbeat in the dark hours, who trusted small changes to yield larger mercies. If we have any final observation, it is this. The lines between engineering prudence and practical daring are often faint, and it is in the dim places between them that individuals like Roderick Banks do their work. They are not reckless. They are careful. They are exacting. And they accept that every change might kill as well as save. That acceptance, that weight of responsibility, is perhaps the truest kind of courage there is. History remembers designs, leaders, and campaigns, and will rightfully call the mosquito a marvel of adaptive thinking. But history should also remember the quiet algebra of maintenance huts, and the men who, without fanfare, calculated how to buy a few extra knots of speed and, with it, a pocket of time where human beings could change their fate.